Good evening, everyone. Welcome back once again to Melty. Tuesday Melt, specifically, with the 2MK team. We are, of course, once again playing Melty Blood. The Melty Blood we played earlier was the EU and therefore set up based on that timing, and today is the second of the two. You can expect to see a lot of quickly flowing play, especially if we get a lot of people joining in. This lounge is, as always, still more or less Atlantic Rim, but on the NA side, and therefore you can expect to see a lot more US play, and if you've got a good enough connection, probably the Midwest is fine. We have a lot of gap difference between our players today. One who basically hasn't played this game in forever, and one who has enough experience with it, even at the local, to have a very clear idea what's going on. Wait, is this supposed to be slightly frozen water now? But if we do get additional people in Lounge today, I'll mostly be running my usual amount of analysis, since that's one of the things that I generally spend my time doing when playing this game, simply because there's so many options in the first place. For those of you who are familiar with our Street Fighter play, it won't be as obvious who is who here, unless you've seen us play other games besides this one. But you could probably make some guesses based on their playstyles. The amount of movement and thought that this game requires isn't actually higher than other games. So far, it seems like mostly what you need to be able to do is track what's going on and understand that specific things are or are not dangerous to you. Training in this is not a thing that you can easily do using anything else. But that, for example, was a relatively easy confirm to do, as are many such things in the game. So, if we do end up talking about specific aspects of it today, we're probably going to be talking only about how to get out of knowledge check or execution check situations presented by other players. Roa, for example, is a perfect example of a character who has a lot of space and screen control, but a lot of execution checks. Not necessarily knowledge checks. You can usually understand what Roa is doing and what you need to do about it. The question is, can you do the thing you need to do about it? He suffers, of course, from being relatively easy to lock down in situations where he hasn't got enough space to get out and doesn't really want to guess in using the super version, the EX version of that move you just saw. He does have a lot of good options overall for getting out of bad situations, but they can result in him being baited into bad things a lot. Fortunately, he is also one of those characters where if you do get your spacing right, you can resolve your problems by shielding correctly and predicting that your opponent is going to go for their own specific way of countering or punishing you. This of course makes him somewhat susceptible to throws. You're probably familiar with Ami Rabbit's general style. And as we mentioned on the previous stream, though again, not necessarily expecting that most people watched that, this was not a thing where Omni needed to spend as much time in the scouting mode, and was more so instrumental in development of Roabot and other systems based on the movement. Similarly, the type of character Roa is means that the way people respond to him in the earlier parts of the game is a little bit less acidic, I guess that's the word. Our last discussion on this game mostly had to do with accuracy. It is one of the main things our bot is meant to train you for, and one of the main things that you will need to understand what's happening. Accuracy in this game is important for winning, sure, but depending on your playstyle and the opponent you're facing, you might be able to just win by locking them down or understanding your opponent's character really well. It is possible to treat this game in a relatively reductionist way. In other words, you don't have to make it so that your opponent actually has a lot of options in terms of what they're doing. If they happen to choose correctly, you might be in a bad situation, but at least you're not confused. But here, you often need the accuracy. Knowing when exactly your opponent is at the edge of the range of a move you want to do. And that they're likely to be open for it. Moves in this game are quite quick compared to many others, and the main reason you don't just see people spamming them is because you have to have the range precisely right in order to not get punished for doing them. This is compounded by the fact that you actually dash forward when you go for a throw, making it even harder. You can't just get away from someone or expect that they're going to definitely miss. Accuracy also leads to you both having extra meter and if you know combos that can be confirmed without having to use the meter off of stray hits, where you might not get as much use out of the meter in the first place, you're usually better served that way. This goes for both your moon moves and your actual use of meter for other purposes. While there are many moves in this game that actually don't give you direct bonuses, they can become much more dangerous when spaced correctly. If your opponent is simply not expecting you to actually use them because they don't know that you can mess with the range enough. Similarly, if you know the ranges really well, you can also use this information to get your opponent to think you're going for something that you're not, and they won't actually be able to whiff punish or counter you in time because they don't recognize that the attack isn't going to hit, forcing them to block and be in a different situation altogether. One of the things that is strongest in this way is in fact the throw itself. Because the throw will generally move you forward, your opponent has to spend a lot more time getting out of the way of a throw or deciding if it's worth their effort to hit a button and try to stop you from doing said throw. But getting out of the way of throws is not easy enough, especially against characters who have good confirms off their lows. Both of these characters are like that, but the specifics of their confirms are very range dependent. The same thing happens when you are trying to set up specific cross-ups or ambiguous left-right mix-ups from the air. While your opponent can mostly shield these, you can specifically try to do things that will miss altogether, leaving them in the shield mode because most people don't have the reactions to release the shield and then go forward from there. For example, you'll note here that while this is very interesting in terms of the opponent building up enough meter, after a while, if you were prepared enough, this really stops doing any actual damage. In fact, it is one of the things that saves players the most when they're just getting used to this game for the first time. An opponent who doesn't have perfect spacing for neutral ends up losing a lot of their damage in really weird spaces because the combos they learn to do, while helpful, don't convert to big damage, they just hit you a lot. Which is great for meter, but at this point I'm basically just getting scratched and nothing else is happening. The important thing they're aiming for is the specific knockdown that gives them a bonus. And therefore my focus should not be make sure that I don't get hit by that combo. My focus has to be about making sure that when I am down after the combo, that I know what to do about it. And of course I can do things like that just to I've seen it coming, so that was the best way to do that. It's super important as you go forward in this game to learn not to panic or be flustered or worried about the fact that when your opponent starts to hit you, they can keep it up for a long time. Because the question is almost always, did you mess up in the interaction that got you there? Not a question of, are you being hit for very long, because the interaction itself is not leading to you taking damage. In fact, often, it's simply, did I overcommit in neutral? Because tapping me out of the air like that actually leads to much more damage as a whole than nearly all of this combo. Does not matter to me. It actually doesn't grant them that much meter either. The problem here is the patience, the recognition that, oh, the combo is over now, so I actually have to do a thing. So you can spend your time more or less relaxing once your opponent lands a hit. Figure out what did you need to do differently to prevent the second hit that you could have defended. The combo itself is fairly irrelevant. So I, for example, am going to ignore most of this and think, how can I get out of this at the next part? I don't actually know this one. I think I can just uppercut out, but what if I didn't want to do that? What would be the best way for Arcade to get out of this situation in a different flow? This is what I was talking about before with the concept of reducing the match to this sort of thing. The opponent is able to be more effective by reducing the match to just, can you get out of my pressure or not? And don't have to be able to win neutral particularly. But this works much better on my character than it does on others. Because while Arcade normally has a way out of everything, it takes a while to learn all of those ways out of everything. It may or may not be worth one's time to do. If you're trying to win, for example, and you have the style of character that isn't good at stopping this situation, you're usually better off using your meter, using heat, using wake up burst style things, if you were able to manage to get through neutral. If you feel as if I could beat this person in neutral, but I keep on losing in pressure, and you need to win, your option is usually better the other way. But now, Arnold faces the problem of a character that isn't really able to be dominated in that way exactly. It's not that she can't do the same thing, reducing this to more or less the same situation over and over again, regardless. But what actually changes is, once moved back to neutral and things have started, how much damage is she going to take while setting that up? You'll notice that more or less nothing different happened there. This technically went for a slightly different combo, or rather pressure, and therefore were able to be shielded. But the overall interaction we're seeing isn't related to much beyond that. But because of the way that the interactions begin, you'll notice that Omni Rabbit's Roa does way more actual damage without actually pulling the combo all that much longer at all. This isn't actually because Roa has better options, or even more straightforward options. It's simply that because Roa can't be pinned down in the same way, it's much easier to deal with the opponent's mindset to continually do the same thing on a character like Roa. Usually implies that if you get pushed back into neutral, you are going to be at a large enough disadvantage that you have to go for bigger hits. You have to try to get the opponent opened up more rather than just pummeling. Of course that helps. I'm still a little salty about the way that Arcwade's works, but that's my fault for not getting the air jump, air throw, wake up timing yet. And I'll gladly work on that. Similarly, understanding which of your attacks will put your opponent in a bad position once they try to counterattack can get you through a lot more matches. Omni similarly has that sort of experience where he's just going to mostly sit through this and watch for the opponent's tendencies and flows, and then do big defensive confirms. Using the gaps, let's say, the holes, to create offense that will end up with that problem, where you aren't exactly sure what the offense you're facing even is. We normally view this as a situation of calm almost entirely. It's probably not fair to think of it this way, but a relatively strong opponent for us is one who does not need to repeat the same things enough for us to stay calm during their offense. Because it really doesn't matter whether or not the offense is doing damage or not. If they're under practiced in how to convert more, let's call it, unconventional offense into big damage. Similar things happen when you are pretty sure you're going to get enough meter to start regaining health and know the point at which your opponent is going to have to break in their offense. So now we'll probably be able to look at the contrast of that. While our Noel does not necessarily know most of this character's ways through Roa's zoning, a lot of dashing and blocking or dashing and shielding is generally enough. She doesn't really need to use moves to close distance in this matchup. It's a matter of learning how far and how long can I run and still get what I want. Similarly, because her pressure as a character doesn't really require you to be close, Roa's quick starter combos and so on don't really work out. I don't remember what the move is done using. I think it's down forward B plus C. And that, of course, is shielded enough that if Roa flinched, she'll just literally power through it. And as you can see, it reaches really far. But you can't be using all of your moon energy on that, so, you know, mix it up. Similarly, you will notice that there is no gap of the same type, that gap where Omni knows for certain you have hit me and put yourself in a position where you can't stop me from activating heat, for example. The quiet in neutral results in a lot more spaces where you can't just take an opportunity. It's something that you have to get used to in this game quite a lot. The fact that an opportunity doesn't always mean that you get a punish. It means that you get a position or a control point that is tactically important in some way. And staying quiet in neutral often leads to those. In fact, you can probably notice that it's actually just that Omni's using the same reaction as against the other Roa, especially on Wake Up. I'm just going to sit here and keep blocking. But because the focus of our Noel is not the same, the outcome is usually different. This can be improved from Omni's side by waiting and then hitting a button, because her moves are slow enough that if she hasn't hit something by a certain time, just like 2A will get out. But normally the problem is that she's not quite close enough for the 2A to even hit, which is what I mentioned before. it stuck? It's somewhat stuck. There. Our new stream schedule means that we are going to be having this lounge only go on until 8:30 Eastern. And we're probably not going to be pushing too far beyond that in any form, so you can expect this one, unlike the Street Fighter one where normally something stays open a bit, you can expect things to close up more. I've forgotten how exactly one count cancels out of that one, but that was an anti-air, and that's what should have happened regardless. This is a similar situation, even though it is not as blatant. If I am on the offense with Arcade, I'm not normally thinking about the amount of damage I'm going to take from my opponent if I mess it up. I have to mess up a certain number of times before I care. It's not really a matter of messing up is bad. In fact, I have a generally good idea of how much damage I'm going to take regardless of what happens. Simply because of that fact that when the opponent's combo starts to get very long, the amount of damage they're actually going to deal to you with that combo diminishes rapidly, and the only thing you actually are worried about is the next interaction. So depending on what resources you have available to you at the time, you might just not care. It is no more or less dangerous even to get punished than any other point at which your opponent gets a good knockdown. This means that the game is actually weirdly binary in that you don't really have to think about whether or not you should be on offense or defense. Just do whatever you feel like at the time and try not to miss. Because it's the number of times you miss that tends to make the bigger difference. Sure, there's the I have made the wrong decision about this timing altogether and therefore been defeated. But that's a different style of problem. Because you can work on those problems differently. This match, for example, has been mostly that. Me making the wrong decision altogether, and my opponent being completely ready for it. But even then, I'm still thinking more or less the same things. I'm not watching for, did I do this right or wrong in terms of my pressure so much, or should I have defended longer? It's that my choice of how to attack was wrong, and I should have thought of something different. For example, that move is much more useful against Roa than other things are, because it forces the Roa player to stay more on the defensive waiting for it, and allows me to do more things in neutral. But the character is a good wall, and that means that you can't just go, I'm going to approach from here or I'm going to approach from there. Things still worked out in the way I expect this matchup to go though, because it isn't in Omni's best interest to hit buttons here. It isn't in Omni's best interest to actually zone Arcade. And if I don't feel like being zoned, this is basically an optimal situation for me. Creating a very specific space where 2A will not hit. Knowing Roa has no options for something to do just as quick other than uppercut, which is risky in its own right. And honestly, I don't actually know if their uppercuts trade in the way that it would have benefited me, but the point is that were it to be the thing that Omni responded with, I would have learned that just now. And therefore I would know whether or not I can get away with using that specific setup in the future. If you don't enjoy moving around a lot, this might not be the game for you actually, now that I'm thinking about it. It's not only very movement heavy, but you have to watch movement a lot too. And we shift on back. game is generally intense enough that the time just flies by, at least from my perspective. Along the same lines as the explanation from before, we see the same issue coming up for Noelle. There are 3 or 4 different things happening here really quickly that look as if they can't be controlled. In a different type of game, they probably wouldn't be controllable. But here, there are things you can do about them. I'll probably go into those in another stream instead, because it's really not the time to be talking about them as a whole. But following the same lines of thought, perfecting the spacing from which you do certain moves basically makes your opponent unable to respond to them in the way that they don't want to. You can even delay the amount of time it takes you before you go into your shield animation, forcing your opponent to stay quiet for longer to wait for you to do that. Similarly, you could simply not do it at all. This is the thing that I've trained against Red Arcade and that our bot can help you train, but I haven't figured out a good way to decide it yet. How to teach people what it is they're trying to do exactly. But overall, it's not going to change, so I'll probably figure out what it is I need to explain some other time. Watching this match is definitely helping me think about it though. If you are forced to be apart and then shield, whether or not to actually press the button to go from the shield into the attack at all is important. And Noelle does have the advantage here in that her moon meter is less necessary for the matchup than Roa's is. She needs it for conversions to damage, but she doesn't really need it to play neutral. The result of that, if you're not familiar with the mechanic, is that she consistently gets to use the form of the shield mechanic where she goes flying across the screen in a kick to the front, rather than having to rely on going to the opposite side of the opponent, which is generally a slower attack. And because she has good moves out of the air like that, she doesn't actually need to reach the opponent for this to be good. The important thing is usually to recognize I don't need X or I don't need Y. If you're thinking in matchup terms, those are the main things you should be spending your mental effort on, figuring out what you don't need in a matchup, and therefore preventing yourself from using the same things over and over again. It's really important for high-level players to do this against each other because they spend so much time being hit, being put through combos, being put through difficult situations that are mostly related to their interactions, that learning those is probably paramount for a lot of them. It is what is interesting about this game from the mastery perspective. As you saw before for a moment, but one might not notice, which move Noelle uses when Roa shields it and flips the other side. She is a character who can just backdash out of that entire interaction and not be at a disadvantage from having done so. Many other characters would not want to dash out of it, because that's just putting them back into neutral that they don't want to be in. But in her case, her backdash is usually just enough that if she has gotten away from a particular opponent and used her backdash, she still has the reach to hit with her weapon, which means that they can't just do as they like. It's that sort of thing that leads to mastery of characters in this game, recognizing I don't need this because of some strength my character has that isn't absolutely common to everyone. Similarly here, she doesn't really need the moon meter, and therefore can just continue to play neutral basically normally despite having none of it. All of her moves that are really important for it are completely offensive, and she can just use her axe to keep the opponent away from her without having to use any. This means that the opponent never looks at the empty moon gauge and thinks to themselves, okay, it's time to go in, it's time to beat her up and do damage, because from their end the situation hasn't changed. The woman will still hit you with an axe. You can see this play out with Omni's Roa in this matchup even more so, because Archway doesn't have a lot of good ways to get close to Roa without having to deal with what's effectively a mix-up. And if she gets into the perfect position, which I'll demonstrate as best I can in a moment, if she gets to like right here, Roa has two options. Basically, I'm shielding because I know an attack is coming, and I'm definitely not going to die to that attack. Or has to worry about her getting slightly closer, like overstressing, and resulting in getting thrown. But if Omni has meter with Roa, this doesn't come up as a problem, because his basically dash lightning solves all of it. But to get to exactly here, with Archwade is basically telegraphing, I am probably going to try to attack you. I've been trying to get to this position for this attack this whole time. So if the situation got bad, that throw was avoidable by just going, okay, I know what you're coming here for. I know that you are trying to get to this position because it's the best one for you. But I have meter. And he's not even susceptible to most things she does if that meter is used at that moment. Certainly not enough to do a lot of damage to her. She doesn't benefit too much from being closer, and she doesn't benefit from being further. I have to be right here exactly. All of her tricks work here, all of her general movement can start from here. I can even super jump from here into crazy things that help out at least a little bit. But Roa's dashing lightning solves all of those things, and the EX version obviously does even better. I think I'm supposed to use the super version of that. Similarly, she can create that situation anytime by just wasting meter in the way I just did. This is the exact space that she ends up at if Roa blocks that move. And there are a lot of characters like that, where because of the knockback strange reaction that you have off of a charging move, they hop back to a distance that suits you. And then there's a bunch of characters who can break this expectation by just doing a move in the air. It's not necessarily well known, but I think Roa can just use the air uppercut style round lightning at that point. Not that it helps, but you can do it. It's not really helpful on Archwade. I think it helps more against Kuma. So I want to get here, and see, nothing happens. This matchup for me is a lot of wasting meter to get into position on things, and then getting all I want out of that. Unfortunately, the problem is that her moves don't actually do the thing I need done. It has to be metered. And that makes it predictable. That said, that was more so demo, and I don't have to spend as much time doing that as I probably made it look like. Cause she has that. A large part of this fight and the Coma fight are based on her ability to just use that move and pressure the opponent without actually doing anything to them that matters. But even that still loses to the dash lightning, leading to the discovery a while back from my side of the fact that I can just use this move instead, as it will hop entirely over it and do nothing on my end. Even that was still technically the same thing, because that position right there was also a mix-up. I had 1 bar of meter left. I could use uppercut, I could use moon version of uppercut, and I could throw. Now, if one had a lot of time to think about it, which is the point, I wouldn't have left that much time, you would have probably thought, oh, the match isn't over, I guess she's going to go for throw because anything else is using up meter she would need to win the next match. But the whole point is that there's not that much time to think about those things. Similarly, that move comes up a lot more in this matchup than in most other matchups, because she doesn't like Roa to be far away after she does something, but she doesn't have a lot of moves that won't end up in some bad situation. So being able to do that is important. This one went on longer than I expected. But we are still mostly getting back into the groove here. And it looks like, unfortunately, these CLs that have joined in are not likely to get any stream time. When you understand enough Japanese, you find yourself half guessing what these characters are saying, and they have the weirdest dialogue sometimes, truly. It's worse when you're not actually sure whether or not you're interpreting them correctly, because I can't figure out if Roa is, like, incredibly a pervert, which I have no problems with personally, but, you know, it's not clear. or so grandiose that he uses terms that don't make sense in Japanese because they're not actually Japanese. We're probably going to have a lot more time tomorrow during the Under Night stream to talk about damage and the ways you should spend your time thinking about matches, especially in this type of game, relative to how long you're being hit. Because that's one of the first things we've definitely tried to teach people about this type of game, particularly Under Night. Don't assume that because you're being hit for a long time that something bad is happening. The opponent hitting you part of the game is a little bit more troublesome in Under Night though, because they have different ways to cause resets and setups and other things that lead to you actually continuing to take damage a lot more. In Melty Blood, most of the time your opponent keeps on hitting you because that's the combo. They basically have to keep hitting you, and they're hitting you to build up meter. Their reward for being able to execute long combos is that they get more meter out of it than someone who can't. And that's basically a good thing. It gives masters an option, something that they can use to dominate a matchup, while not terribly overwhelming other players into not getting as many interactions as they might need to actually play the game. In fact, if anything, it helps in the other way. If you're not getting completely locked down, you're learning all of the other things that they can do with their meter as well. This is one of the games I would suggest watching replays basically more than any other. You really need to understand what's happening in matches. And you can use it just to spend your time checking how much damage did I really take from that interaction. Do I even need to care? Because there are a few situations where the thing that has happened to you, your risk-reward concept of whether or not you should do a specific thing needs to be really updated. Noel's vaulting uppercut is a really good example of this. Theirs is only a very specific subset of characters, especially the moon version of that move, that will do a big damage to her because she's done it. This seems really weird, but because it has such strange properties in terms of where it interacts with people, you can just use this move a lot. You can use it in neutral, you can use it to save yourself from stuff. You can spend a lot of time ignoring the fact that your opponent is blocking and punishing you for this move. Particularly so when they have less meter of some kind. In fact, the only real downside to continually using it is that you will run out of moon to use it with, and therefore most of your other options. Also, it's hard to convert properly off of. I'm not absolutely sure of that because I think I've seen people do it well, but because it can hit in so many different ways, you do have to work on it a lot. Yep, this went on even longer than I thought it would. Stream will be ending after this. You can join us tomorrow for Wednesday Night in Birth. We are expecting to have the morning stream, EU stream, depending on your perspective on it, as well as the evening one. And we're not sure whether or not there will be any specific releases of bots or work on bots for this week as a whole, so nothing will specifically be given for Friday, though you should still almost certainly see the King of Fighters stream on Thursday. But with that, we've come to the end of this one, and probably the end of the lounge will follow soon after. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.